of a brief explanation of like what ABA itself is. A lot of the next couple lessons are going to be very specific about ABA, how you guys can use that kind of stuff in your lives, how that kind of works. And so we're also, at the end, we're also talking about prompting. So, and all the fun different kinds of prompting. So, okay. So who wants to maybe take a stab at talking about what ABA is? Maybe someone whose kid's in ABA. What you guys have kind of seen, what it looks like.
To me, it seems like it's just trying to train the child to focus on adult-led activities.
Definitely. That's great. Maybe else?
This is a very structured kind of it's not oversimplification, kind of like Pavlov's dog or something. You're trying to get your child to do something based on very specific tasks, and then you give them a reward to kind of condition them to
Perfect.
learn that, whatever.
Yeah, definitely. We're going to talk about Pavlov and talk about all that. That's great. Anything else? Okay. So the kind of the way that I like to think about ABA is kind of this big kind of umbrella concept. Like if you Googled like define ABA, like you wouldn't get anything. Like it's kind of complicated. And I think the easiest way to kind of think about it is that ABA is a style of teaching that's aimed at changing behavior. And so obviously behavior is a really, really broad term. That could be like negative behaviors, like aggressive behaviors, tantrums, things like that. It could also be like academic behavior, like knowing your academic principles, or self-help things, so potty training, dressing yourself, taking care of yourself, and other things like that. So it can, behavior is really, really broad. So ABA is based on behaviorism, and we're going to talk about behaviorism and kind of the history of that. We're going to talk about operant conditioning, which is kind of what you were talking about, Jason. And it's ABA is very, very data intensive, so that kind of takes that subjective feeling from the therapist out. We really rely on that data to know when kids have mastered things, so that we know that they're ready to move on to new things. So it's individualized to every child, which makes it really good. So I'm just going to show you really fast. So this cute little guy right here is Dr. Ivar Lovaas. Have any of you guys heard of him? Yeah? Okay, so I think that he's a really interesting guy, and I kind of like to talk about him and how ABA kind of came to be, because I think it's a pretty great story. So kind of back in the day, like in the 1950s, people thought kind of two different things about autism. It was that kids were born with all the intelligence they were ever going to have, and so once they hit that plateau, that they weren't going to be able to learn anything else. And kind of the other frame of thought was that parents, like mothers specifically, created autism in their kids by being cold and detached and aloof parents. So this guy was just like, that's not right. I don't think that that's true. I do think that these kids can learn. I don't think that it has anything to do with how they're parented. So he kind of took this professional dare, basically, from one of his colleagues that he could find a way to teach these kids. And so it was outside of UCLA, and he started doing these randomized trials with all these kids, and that's how kind of ABA came to be. It was basically him proving to his professional colleagues in the community in California that he could teach these kids, and it didn't have anything to do with the moms or the parenting style or the dads. So I think that that's kind of great. He's like one of the first real advocates for parenting children with autism, and so I think that he's really cool in that way. So he, it took a lot of years for him to kind of develop it, and that's why ABA is one of the best like research-based options for kids with autism, is because it's been studied for so long. Like some of the other treatment methods that are out there that maybe don't have that empirical backing doesn't mean that they won't someday. It's just that ABA's been around the longest, and so we've had way more time to study it and see, how effective it can be. So, have you guys heard that, like the refrigerator mother's term before? Yeah?
Remind me.
That's kind of just that thought that like mothers who are cold and aloof and detached. And that's how that autism came to be. And I think that that's, like, even though that came out in like the 1950s, I think that that's still kind of out there, that thought, and I think that can really affect like parents' views when maybe they hear that their kid's getting diagnosed with autism. And you might refer back to this and think, oh, well, maybe it was something I did. And I think that, this guy definitely really helped prove that that's not the case. It doesn't have anything to do with the parents. And I think that's really empowering, knowing that it's not, you didn't do anything wrong. If you would have done something else, that you could have helped and it not happen or whatever. Yeah.
There's a great scene about that in the Temple Grandin movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you guys all seen that Temple Grandin movie?
Not yet.
Yeah, I would highly recommend that movie. And she comes to Utah a lot to speak, specifically at the University of Utah. I've seen her speak there and at the Pingree Center where I used to work quite a few times, and she's really amazing to hear her speak. She's great. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about behaviorism and kind of how that came to be. This was kind of a little bit before Dr. Lovaas's time, but kind of in the same kind of time period. So, is anybody taking a Psych 101 class in here? Maybe. Okay, so some of the influential people that you probably would have heard about in one of those psych classes are B.F. Skinner, who's that cool little grandpa guy that's pictured right there. So he is kind of famous for really being the father of behaviorism. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that happened and what parts of that are still relevant for today. So B.F. Skinner is kind of known for what's called a Skinner box. Has anybody heard of a Skinner box before? So Skinner box is where you put a rat in a box, and it's wired, and there's two buttons, and maybe one's red and one's green. And so if they hit the red one, then they get a piece of cheese, and if they hit the green one, they might get a mild electric shock. And so he was which is pretty sad, but he was able to use these Skinner boxes really effectively in showing that reinforcement was really, really powerful as a motivator, which I think now kind of seems intuitive to us, but, back then it was they didn't know, and so we have all this research that backs up the thought that, if you get something good for something good that you did, you're more likely to do it again. So Albert Bandura, who is also a cute little grandpa guy, made a theory called the social learning theory, which I think is another thing that's really intuitive, but I think it's also really important historically. So basically, social learning theory is just that as humans, we're innately social creatures, and we have to see other people do things for us to learn how to do it. You can explain it to somebody, but unless they actually see it, it fires off your little mirror neurons in your brain, and that is how you're going to learn to do things. So I think that's, do we all feel that's probably true for our kids? Maybe you explain something to Finn a lot, but unless you show him how to do it, he might not know how.
Yeah, he's very good role.
Yeah. So I think that's true for all kids, not just kids on the spectrum, not just kids with disabilities, for everybody. So he obviously was really important. And, John Watson did a lot with rats and mazes, which is kind of this other little picture right there, that he showed that if you put cheese in a maze, you could get a rat to go through the maze a lot faster, and they could learn that maze a lot more efficiently with that cheese as a motivator. So how do you guys think that these kinds of people and those theories apply to our kids with autism and with ABA specifically? Do you guys have any ideas? Not really.
Well, as far as the mouse in the maze, certain behaviors are hard for kids on the spectrum to do. Social, just basic social skills. But if they're motivated, they'll be more willing to exert themselves and do something that's hard.
Definitely. How many lessons did we spend on talking about different kinds of reinforcement? 3. It's huge. Reinforcement is so huge. That's why it's that foundation that we can't talk about anything about ABA without that super foundational reinforcement, So I think that's great. Any other ideas about that? You're getting so big. Cool. Well, I think that this kind of applies to ABA in that, you do have to use that reinforcement. You do have to be conditioned to know why it's good to do certain things. So kind of just a little bit more from what you were saying. If you can show that rat that hitting that red button is a good thing, and hitting that green button is a bad thing. The green button is bad behavior, and the red button can be a lot of different things. It can be your social skills. It could be taking care of yourself independently. It could be, it could be a lot of different things. It's totally individualized to every kid. So, any comments, questions about this stuff? Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about operant conditioning. I think this cartoon is pretty funny. So it says, watch what I can make Pavlov do. As soon as I drill, he'll smile and right in his little butt. So if you guys remember Pavlov, he would give dogs this meat and make them salivate. And so he started this experiment where he would ring a bell when he presented that meat to that dogs, and eventually the dogs would drool when they just heard the bell, even if the meat was not present. So I think that this is kind of funny. But I also think that when, like as a therapist providing ABA, that I'm kind of conditioned too. I've conditioned myself and the kids conditioned me, and we're kind of in this like cyclical relationship. So I'm conditioned that I'm going to give you reinforcement if you do what I asked. And they're conditioned to know that they're going to get that reinforcement. So it's kind of like this mutually beneficial, and we all have to work together to get everything done. It's not just about the kid. It's equally as much about the therapist or the parent or the caregiver or whoever is trying to help the kid learn something. So we're going to try to define operant conditioning. You're basically just making something a habit or breaking a habit. So you're going to do that using reinforcement or using a punishment or a consequence. So it can go both ways. And we talked about this a lot in the third lesson where we talked about behavioral management, about how if you accidentally pair a reinforcement with a bad behavior, then you're going to make that bad behavior happen more often. But if you pair a consequence or a punishment with a bad behavior, then you're going to break that bad habit, and that bad habit's going to go away. So that's kind of this idea of operant conditioning. So can you guys think of a time when maybe you conditioned, or one way or the other, one of your kids to do, like have a good behavior or to get rid of a bad behavior, or something along, or maybe that you reinforced a bad behavior and made that a habit? And either one of those, any three of those options. Any ideas? Okay. Well, I think that for like a lot of kids, like in ABA obviously, like we're really reinforcing that attention, and attention can be something that's pretty difficult for a lot of kids on the spectrum. So if we really reinforce that, then we're going to make that a bigger habit for those kids. They're going to realize that making that eye contact, that really meaningful social eye contact, is actually a good thing, even if it maybe is uncomfortable for them for whatever reason, whether it's their, in their sensory systems, or just, emotionally it's uncomfortable. But you can help them using operant conditioning. You can get that a lot more, and that's something we work on a lot in ABA. So, okay. So the type of ABA that Bridges uses, since it's this big kind of umbrella term, is called discrete trial training. So basically, it's like this methodology that we change behavior through kind of this equation. I'm not totally sure why that keeps looking like a little square. It's supposed to kind of look like a little D. So an SD, which leads to R, which leads to C. So we're going to kind of talk about each one of those individually. So again, that should be SD. So the SD, that stands for stimulus discriminant. So just hearing those two words, what do you guys think that means? Yeah.
What you're asking the child to do, like whatever it is, like the direction.
Yeah, definitely. So it is the direction. So when you think about it, like how do you ever know if someone's talking to you? Like what's the most basic way that you know that you're being addressed by someone? Your name. Yeah. I mean, that's huge. So for a lot of kids on the spectrum, you have to like help them realize that that name belongs to them. That is something that's going to help you get pulled out of the environment and realize that someone's trying to talk to you, trying to give you something, trying to address you in some way. So that's kind of like the first very basic part of an SD. It's going to have to be your name so that you know that they're talking to you, not the therapist, not the other therapist, not the other kids in the class, not your brother, not your sister, not your mom, not your dad, but you. So, obviously this is going to be a huge thing for kids. And I think it's really funny, when I was a child, my mom would always call me my sister's name and vice versa, and that always made me so mad. Because I was like, no, you know what my name is, you only have 2 kids, you can get my name right. But now that we're in a class with 14 kids, there's a lot more options to get wrong, and I totally do it too. And the kids just get equally as frustrated with me now. But I have to, I don't just have one name I cycle through like my mom did. It's Johnny, Susie, Billy, Georgie, So, yeah, I just think that's funny. So, So the next part of that, the SD, after that, we move to the R, which stands for response. So the response is how the child responds to the direction. So there's kind of 3 different options that we use in discrete trial training. Either they respond correctly or incorrectly, or they don't respond at all. So every single program that a kid works in with ABA, within ABA rather, it's going to have a different SD, and that's going to dictate a different response. So since everything is totally individualized, the response is also individualized for the child. Whether or not they have verbal language, whether or not they sign, whether they use text, whether they use some other mode of communicating, that's going to kind of tailor how we're going to determine whether that response is correct, not correct, or a non-response. So like we do, just to kind of talk about some of the programs that we frequently use programs in ABA, we do like a following directions program. So the SD for that kind of program would be their name paired with whatever that direction is going to be. So maybe it would be like, Luke, put this in the trash can. So what would a correct response in that situation be? Puts it in the trash. Pretty good. Yeah, that one's pretty straightforward. So what about incorrect? Probably more options of what could be incorrect than correct in this case.
I'll play with my car.
Yeah, definitely. So if he just goes off task and it's just like, my car, I'm gonna play with my car. What if he put it in his shoe? Paper in his shoe instead of in the trash? Probably incorrect. So what do you guys think a non-response in that case would look like?
Ignores you completely.
Yeah,
I mean, he's looking at you but doesn't, or is attending to you but doesn't do anything.
yeah, definitely. So that is definitely what we consider a non-response within ABA, is when a kid has that attention, that they're on task and they're just kind of, sitting there, and maybe it's compliance or maybe it's comprehension. So there's kind of 2 different options of why that non-response may happen. It's either going to be that compliance where they just don't feel like it, they don't want to, they think it's dumb, whatever, or maybe they really don't have that language comprehension, and so we really have to kind of tease that out and see what that is, because we need to obviously deal with that differently. If it's a compliance issue rather than a comprehension issue, it's going to be 2 very different ways of how we're going to handle it. Okay, so in like another situation, maybe we're working on having a kid like label colors. So if I said, like, Finn, like, what color is this marker? Like, what would a correct response be?
Black.
Black. What would an incorrect response be? Purple, orange, green, blue. Yeah. Non-response, gonna be kind of the same thing again. We might count, like, non-response, like, also, like, I want to play with my car, or if they got up and like ran away from the work session, we'd also consider that a non-response too. So what do you guys think comes after the response? What do you think is the next sensible step in that equation? And it starts with a C, if you don't remember, give you a hint.
Consequence.
Yeah, perfect. So, consequence. So I think that sometimes consequence, that word kind of has a negative connotation, but within the discrete trial training format, consequence is not negative at all. Consequence can be that you get a huge hug and a Cheeto and something super reinforcing, but it could also mean kind of what the more typical definition of consequence may mean. So it can be positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, punishment, different things like, anything really. So in the case that we were talking about like colors, what do you think would what would the consequence be for Finn if he correctly named this marker as being black?
Get a Cheeto?
Yeah, positive reinforcement, right? That's awesome. So what do you think about if he said that this was orange? How do you think we would deal with that? This is trickier. I just
No Cheeto.
no Cheeto. You're
Well,
yeah.
you give them a chance to try again.
Right,
to guess again.
definitely. Yeah, so another part that's built into discrete trial training is what we call errorless learning. So if he was to say like that this was orange, I'm gonna help him practice that the correct way so that it doesn't get like stuck in his brain that this is orange. We don't want him to practice that a lot of times it being wrong. We want him to every time be successful. We want it to always be a positive experience because we always want him to get that reinforcement, right? So maybe if he says that this is black, he'd be like, oh Finn, it's orange, say orange. And if Finn said, or I totally said that wrong, but if I said it's black, Finn, say black, and then he said black, then he still did it. He's getting that practice. He's getting that the right way. Then he'll still get reinforcement for that. So that's kind of that errorless learning kind of coming in. So what do you guys think about non-response? What do you think would happen given a non-response?
Get their attention.
Say that again.
Get their attention.
Yeah.
Somehow.
Yeah, definitely.
Bring them out of it.
Yeah. Like, come on, pay attention. Sure, okay. So kind of, if I had to like break ABA down into like one picture, it would probably, that is an awful marker, would probably be this. So an SD, so that's gonna be their direction, which leads to their response. What kind of responses did we talk about? What's kind of the options?
Correct, incorrect, and non-response?
So I'm just gonna kind of abbreviate those. Correct, incorrect, and non-response. Okay, so what comes after response, regardless of what the response was?
Consequence.
Consequence, yes. Okay, if it's positive, what kind of consequence do they get?
Cheeto.
Positive, yeah, positive reinforcement. So, this is kind of a crazy picture. It looks better on the board. What about negative?
No Cheeto, no.
No Cheeto.
The broccoli.
Broccoli. You will have broccoli and you will love it. Okay, so do you guys remember we talked about errorless learning? So if they get a negative response, what's going to be our next step?
Give them the correct answer.
Right.
Read them through it.
Okay, so you can kind of think about that as, we're just going to start over. What about non-response?
Same thing, but
Seems like it's gonna be the same thing.
Yeah,
But you need to get their attention first before you have to do the same thing.
good thought. Okay, so that's kind of big. I'm just going to erase that, you guys. We'll put a happy face instead. It's a little bit smaller. So what do you guys think? After they get their positive reinforcement as their consequence, what do you think happens after that? This isn't on the slides.
Would you go back and, I know the D is for discrete, but why do you say SD?
It stands for stimulus discriminant. So that's basically just like the fancy way of saying like the direction so the kid knows that we're talking to them. So it's gonna be their name plus the direction of whatever the program you're working on. Does that make sense? Right,
It's just a test,
Huh?
or it's just whatever you want them to do.
Right. Yeah. Fancy word. Easy. So, okay, so what do you guys think? After positive reinforcement, what do you think is gonna happen after that?
try it again.
With a different,
It's like totally cyclical. I mean, so have you seen ABA with Luke before? Have you ever watched it? Okay. So if you've ever seen ABA, like you might see the therapist work on the same thing with your kid 10 times in a row. So why do you guys think that is?
Repetition.
Repetition.
Get the thought plan with that.
Yeah, definitely. So I don't know what the exact numbers on this are, but like I've heard that something like for typical kids, it's like 200 times to try something and commit it to mastery, right? Obviously, kids with disabilities, it's gonna take many more times, right? So we're gonna use this format, it's a beautiful picture right now, over and over and over again, until we can see in that data that that concept is so cemented in their brain that it's not falling out. It's gonna stay in there. Whether it's that this marker is black, or that when I say go to trash, that you put something in a trash can, or anything, until we can see in that data that you respond positively enough times that we can tell that that's mastered.
Okay, now, does it matter though, as you're doing the repetitions, if you can see they're getting frustrated with it? Do you stop the cycle when you're not wanting to go along with this any further?
I think that's a great question. So something else that kind of plays into this is the child's personality. We really value kids being individuals, and we want everything to be individualized. So we use this format constantly, but that doesn't mean I'm gonna just ask Finn for 3 hours while he's here, what color is this marker? What color is this marker? Because, how motivated would Finn be regardless of what the reinforcement is if he's just gonna say black the whole time? Is that really that great of a teaching and learning opportunity for Finn? Probably not. We need to keep Finn's mind engaged, and Luke, and any other kid that's in ABA. We need to keep their mind engaged. We need to have things that are just beyond their level, so that they're constantly doing like a little stretch. But it's not so much that they get frustrated. It's not too easy that they're demotivated. So it's kind of, we're constantly talking about like this balancing act, right? So it's another example of how we need to balance that. We want them to stay engaged, but at the same time, for some kids, and this is not always the case, but some kids, we're working on things we know that they know how to do because it's a compliance thing, right? You gotta learn that you need to do stuff when adults ask you to. You know what I mean? So it's like, even, Brianna probably knows her colors, but maybe if Brianna had an issue with compliance, maybe we're just gonna work on colors just to help you be more compliant, not because of the color task. But for another kid, maybe they don't know their colors, and so we are going to use the colors as the color task. They're learning their colors, and that's the point of the task. So sometimes things are taught in different ways for different reasons, and there's like a different motivation behind it. So that's definitely where that individualized part comes in. You definitely have to know your kid, you definitely have to know your client, and know like what's going to be the best for them. And so sometimes I think for kids where it is a compliance issue, it can get really frustrating really fast. So if they're working on, maybe 6 colors, and they're working on those and they're bored and they're being not compliant, what do you guys think their data is going to show if they're not being compliant? Probably like they don't know how to do it. That's what the data would say. But if the point's being compliant, they're just going to have to keep working on that until the data shows us that. You know what I mean? So it's hard. It's kind of like this, almost like a vicious cycle for some of those kids sometimes if they can't just break down those walls and do those things.
It can be tricky to figure out if it's compliant with the other, because Brianna's extremely intelligent.
Yeah.
Which means there's some things she learns really easily, but if she has to put effort into learning something, she's extremely non-compliant about it.
Yeah.
She doesn't like the process of having to learn something new. She likes it being easy for her.
Definitely.
And so I can see this one.
I think a lot of us as grown-ups are like that too. And like, I feel like a lot of things that I'm good at myself. And my husband really loves tennis. And I suck at tennis, so I'm like, I'm never playing tennis. Go play tennis by yourself. So I totally relate to Brianna in that. Like, if it takes more effort and you don't have this innate talent in that area, like, that can be really frustrating. And we try to be very sensitive to that. We want to give you, I'm not just going to say, Brianna, the only thing, you're going to work on 6 colors, and you're only going to work on 6 colors all day. We're going to cycle it. We want to have kids engaged. We don't want to inundate them with one task so much that it's completely demotivating. And what do you guys think would happen if they're completely demotivated and they're totally bored? What do you think would happen?
I'm not going to get anything out of it.
Yeah, and you might get the opposite effect. You might get a lot of really bad behaviors that are coming up. That maybe wouldn't have come up before if you were being more varied in your approach and you were giving them more interesting things to do. So we definitely look at the amount of behavior that's happening to kind of guide us too. If we see that like that little Susie is having so many behaviors and so many tantrums, which she works on following directions, like depending on what the reason why Susie's on following directions, that's gonna change how we deal with that situation. You know, maybe she's bored, maybe she's mastered it, we'll push her through faster. But if it's a compliance thing, you know, we're gonna deal with that differently too. Does that make sense? Okay. Cool. So we're gonna talk about prompting now, so I am gonna switch to this
So how
other.
do you decide what behaviors you're going after next?
Say that again.
So how do you decide what behaviors you're going after next?
That is a great question. So for us, a lot of the way that we decide that is a lot of times based on what you guys tell us. We want our kids' treatment to be very like parent-led. I would never say that I know that Finn needs this if that's not a priority for you guys. We also look to their developmental assessments to see where like holes might be that maybe wouldn't be as obvious just by observing Finn or from you guys knowing Finn. Like maybe, you know, like pronouns is like kind of a good, for instance, like a parent or a therapist might not notice that a kid consistently uses incorrect pronouns. But that might be something that we notice, and if we can fix that, then that helps their language develop faster and further. So we kind of use like the different developmental domains to decide how we do that too. So that's like gross motor, which is like your big movements, like your trunk, your arms, your legs, versus fine motor, versus like cognitive skills and academic skills. Those two kind of go together. And self-help skills, which is like taking care of yourself, and social skills, and you know, different things like that. And so we kind of have like this big master list of things that we know how to do, but we also, if like a kid comes and they have something that's maybe missing that we've never seen before, then we write a program for it. You know, it's like we don't just have like 50 programs. It's like every kid goes through all these programs in this exact same order, because it's not very individualized, right? Like Finn's totally different from Luke, who's totally different from Brianna, who's totally different from every other kid. You know, so we have to be really flexible on how we choose what kind of things they need to work on. Does that answer that question? So, as we were kind of talking about errorless learning, a way that we're going to help those kids always have that positive, successful component is by using prompting. So we're going to kind of talk about prompting. When you guys hear that word, what does that mean to you? What does that make you think of?
Give some sort of suggestion.
Yeah,
Yeah, like a cue or something.
definitely. Anything else come to mind? Prompting? Okay, so prompting is just providing extra support so that we can help a child be successful in something. Doesn't matter what it is, there's lots of different kinds of prompting, so that what the task is going to dictate what kind of prompting is going to be the most appropriate for that task. So when you guys think about that, what kinds of prompts do you think there are? Like what ways do you help your children learn new skills?
Physical prompt.
Okay.
Luke's a master at this one. Sometimes it's just a matter of he gets overwhelmed by a direction like this, like it's not necessarily that he doesn't want to go do it, but if you say like the other day I said, Luke, will you go get me Graham's diaper, which Luke is still in diapers, so he picked his diaper out, and I said, that's Luke's diaper, go get Graham's diaper, and he just had a meltdown. It wasn't, so I had to like help him physically. It was, as soon as I helped him, it was just picking him up and showing him where the right diapers were, then he was fine, but we do lots of physical like help. He does the squawk and drop, that's what we call it. He squawks and then he falls to the floor.
Right.
So that's when we do the physical prompts a lot, instead of just letting him. Sometimes he will let himself regulate, but sometimes he needs to just be prompted.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in the grocery store, you can't just leave Luke in aisle 3 or whatever.
Yeah, and I know no one would take him as he's squawking on the floor, but he needs to get up. So
Cool. Okay, anybody else think of any different kinds of prompts? Verbal, definitely. Any other ones? Or how do you use that? How do you use verbal?
Just give him a verbal, giving him verbal hints before asking the question. It's not, learn or kind of teach him. Yesterday I was trying to teach him some addition with fruit snacks. And so a verbal prompt would be, just a clue or a hint
Yeah,
to the right answer.
definitely. It's perfect.
And you can also prompt them, for example, say first, the thing, if you're teaching red, let's say, you said, red, what is it? So you already give the prompt at the beginning, so the child will be successful at the trial.
Right. So we call that modeling. So you're modeling your correct answer. Anybody else think of any other ways? Maybe you guys use prompt? We'll kind of talk about them briefly. There's a lot of other ones. So kind of a good rule of thumb to think about is we don't want to provide more prompting than the kid needs to be successful, but we want them to be successful, so giving them the right amount. So you kind of run the risk of if you provide too much that they're going to become prompt dependent, and if you give too little, then they might not be successful, and then they're getting a lot of practice of doing something the wrong way. And we would hate to see that skill get practiced incorrectly so many times that that's what gets cemented in rather than the correct way. Okay, so, we talked a little bit about physical, so we kind of break physical down into two kind of subgroups. All physical, which is maybe kind of how you guys have to help Luke, like in public, with the, what did you call it?
The squawk and drop.
When that happens. So, you might have to get under Luke, put your arms under his shoulders and physically help him stand up and kind of help him walk. But in another situation, if you're trying to get a kid to point at something, maybe you just need to touch their elbow and kind of send them in the right direction. They don't need that intrusion of you going through and pulling all their fingers down to make that point and then actually fully doing it. They don't need that much support, maybe. Maybe if you just are remember, kind of supposed to point to something, kind of do it, then that can help them be more successful and it's less intrusive that way. So that's kind of the difference between full physical and partial physical. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So we kind of talked about modeling. Modeling is so important. We use modeling all the time. I like to tell a lot of our new staff that basically you're getting your paycheck to come here and model everything for these kids. We're the ultimate models. We're gonna model every single good behavior. We're gonna model everything you should be doing in this environment to you, so that you always know exactly what we're asking. This kind of goes back to that social learning theory we were talking about earlier. If you need, how are you supposed to learn if you've never seen it happen before? Kind of goes, you guys know about mirror neurons that humans and monkeys have. There's specific little neurons in your brain that fire when you see someone do something, and that helps you learn how to do it. So there's evidence of that happening. That modeling is so important. So there's also gesture. So what do you guys think about? What do you guys think a gesture is? How could you use a gesture as a prompt?
Shaking your head.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, shaking your head yes, shaking your head no.
I have to laugh on that one a little bit, because I'm big on gesturing with my other children,
Okay.
but Brianna's not like the other kids in the family, and so sometimes you try to use the same kind of look that I would give my other kids, and it's just lost on her. I mean,
Right.
it's just not.
It's a little bit too subtle maybe.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
you maybe use facial expressions as
we have
gestures?
to really exaggerate if we want to get the point across, because otherwise she's kind of just thinking, what?
Mom, you ate something sour. What's up with you?
What?
Sure, okay. You guys think of any other ways that we would use gestures? Pointing's probably a gesture.
Does that include all kinds of body language and stuff?
Definitely. Yeah, so I think that normally we kind of think of hand gestures when we're talking, but you definitely can use your whole body, even your eyes themselves can gesture. If you're in your eyebrows, your face is so very expressive that if you're looking at something with your eyebrows up super high, that's gonna give your kid a clue. That's gonna gesture towards what the correct answer is. Okay. Yeah.
Also, when you don't want the child to do something, you can stand, but there is just, no, and you just put, you don't even touch the child, but it's this is your limit.
Right.
No. And it's very effective because it's not a word no,
Right.
it's a no. And then you say, oh, okay, I
Right.
cannot cross that boundary.
Yeah, definitely. That's great. It's a great example. So we also use inflection prompts, and there's some overlap between gesture and inflection. What do you guys think that inflection might be in terms of prompting?
Tone of your voice.
Definitely. If I say like "Good job, Finn," as opposed to "Good job, Finn," I mean, huge difference, right? What else do you guys think?
Again, inflection is a challenge at our house though.
Yeah.
It was really hard for Brianna. I had to learn a completely different way of speaking with her because certain sounds in my voice set her off, and I'm like, okay. I have to go back, so it can be a touchy one with some kids, the way you say things, the sound of your voice.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that a mom in the class on Wednesday was talking about how with her son, you know, she really has to be very, very aware of how she uses this with him, because if she sounds like the least bit aggravated, like her voice like goes up at all, then that becomes like very internalized with him, and then the teaching moment's lost because he's just like, you're so mad at me, why are you so mad at me, I hate that you're mad at me, and he can't like remember what led mom to that point, and it becomes all about him.
Don't yell at me, and you haven't even raised your voice.
Yeah,
Or
definitely.
at least you don't think you have.
Right.
I get that one from Brianna. She'll say, I don't want you to yell at me.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that's like a good like part for us to say that obviously like these prompts are gonna look different with different kids in different circumstances, and they have to be, you know, individualized to everyone's kid. So like inflection, like the way that you might use that with Brianna is probably gonna vary from how Keisha uses that with Luke. Okay. So position. What do you guys think about that? I think this one's a little bit trickier. It's not really a lot different than the rest of these. So, if you're teaching colors, for instance, and I was holding up two markers and was like, Johnny, point to red, and he was having a hard time being successful that way, a way that I could use a position prompt to help him be more successful would be that I would move the red closer to him. He'd be more likely to point out and touch the one that's going to be closer to him and towards him. Does that make sense? So how do you guys think that you guys could use position prompts, maybe outside of like ADA, but like with your kid in your home life? Ladies?
I don't know if this is what you're looking for, but okay, let's say that you're trying to help your child go down the slide, and it's scary to them, so you position them closer to the bottom.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. That's great. Definitely. That's, you know, it makes it easier for them. Definitely. We had a gal in here that works in early intervention that does like the learning box program with some kids through EI. And she was talking about how she uses position prompts a lot to help kids learn shapes, like using a shape sorter. Like if the kid's holding a square, that maybe she's gonna turn that shape sorter so that that square is closer to him, so that he has a better chance of getting that square in there before he becomes frustrated, so that he can be more successful and it's a more positive experience. You know, puzzles are obviously like something that you could use this with as well. So there's a lot of different ways that you can use position. So proximity, kind of similar. What do you guys think about that? Anything?
I was thinking that proximity also is not only about toy, but for example, when children are having a hard time focusing on your face, where are you going to position the child? Nearby you, in front of you, on top of the table, so he's able to understand verbal directions by looking at your face, or depending what the goal is.
Definitely. Yeah, and we think about that a lot. We're very purposeful with how we set up things in ABA, and it's very individualized for every kid. So if we know that like maybe one kid really likes the decorations on the wall and that's very distracting during work sessions, then maybe we're not going to put that kid right next to the wall. If one kid maybe wants to escape work sessions, then maybe we're gonna position them in a way that, you know, I'm closer to the door and they're further away, so if they try to escape the work session, that I'm gonna be able to be mobile and that hopefully I can, you know, respond to that situation before that escape happens. So, also another way that you can use position prompt that I forgot is, have you guys heard of like the midline, that concept of the midline? Kind of like the imaginary line that goes through your field of vision that divides left from right. So a lot of kids on the spectrum will have issues like, you know, taking like one hand and crossing the midline. And that's something that's like pretty common for us to see, that it's hard to take right hand and put into your left visual field and vice versa. So a lot of times we'll use position prompts for kids like that. You know, if they're always pointing on the right side or they're always pointing on the left side. So how do you guys think that we might deal with something like that? How we could adapt that to use a position prompt to help them be more successful?
I'm not sure I'm understanding what you're saying. So you're saying that children on the autistic spectrum, they go usually one way or the other? What do you mean pointing right or pointing left? I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
So there's kind of like this imaginary line that kind of is like down the middle of your face, right? And it kind of like divides like your field of vision from, which is like respectively like your right side and your left side. So some kids on the spectrum will have a hard time crossing this invisible line. So putting their right hand in the left side of space or putting their left hand in the right side of space can be really difficult for them.
So you're saying it bugs them, or they just don't want to do it, or they?
It's like a developmental thing. That's just a skill that a lot of us kind of take for granted, and that some kids on the spectrum, they actually have to like learn how to do that, where we kind of pick up on it naturally. So kind of like a real world instance, I've seen kids that this is so developed in that they'll only eat food from one side of their plate. They completely ignore something on the other side of their plate because it's so hard for them to take their dominant hand and put it onto the other side. So their parents they'll eat one half of their plate and their parents will have to turn the plate so that they can eat the other half of the plate. Does that make sense?
I think we're probably all gonna go home and check our kids out.
Right? I think that's like a pretty like severe representation of that. But like with a lot of kids, they will have like way weaker motor skills on their non-dominant side of their body. Like, and so like going up a ladder is really hard because their left arm and their left arm and left leg are a lot weaker because it's hard for them to cross the midline and do things with the non-dominant side of their body. So it doesn't have to be as severe as like I only eat food from like one half of my plate. It might just affect like motor skills and different things like that too. Does that kind of make sense?
So how do you position a toy in order for them to cross the middle line?
So probably the way that we would first start by doing it, rather than doing like left and right, we would probably do like up and down. That kind of eliminates the need to cross the midline either way, and that's going to help that kid be a lot more successful that way if that's something that maybe that kid's dealing with. So does that midline thing kind of make sense? That's just another way we use
It's new to me. I've never heard that before. So.
Okay. It's a lot of OT stuff focuses on that.
One of the exercises that is very good for them is just to have them touch their, like this. Oh, let's see if you can copy this. And that's crossing the middle line. Or the Willie Acha song, Willie Acha, Willie Acha. That helps also, but
Right.
some of our children won't be able to understand. But if they see you, perhaps they will try.
We model it. Yeah, definitely. So we actually work on that kind of stuff a lot in ADA with kids that's an issue with. And we do it like, we do a lot of things with like figure eights, like doing that sideways, like getting like ribbons on strings and having them like do eights and kind of cross that midline. That can be, so there's lots of easy ways that you can like work on that skill. But a way that, you know, we would help that kid be more successful in the short run would be to use a position prompt and have it be up and down to kind of eliminate that need to cross from right side to left side if that was an issue for that child. Okay. So in terms of like simplification, how do you guys think that we can use that as a prompt?
Breaking directions into simpler steps or sentences into sections instead of a whole long big sentence maybe?
Definitely.
Can you use expressions only?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Good. just without words, just having them try to reach it and then put it up and have it, if they reach it up or?
I think that maybe that would be closer to like modeling maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But like with simplification, another way, I think that your census example was really good. If we're trying to have a child like pick out like the ball amongst like 15 different objects, and I mean obviously that's like a lot of what we call like distractors, and that might be really hard. So you know if they're having a hard time being successful finding that ball within that large group, maybe we would make that 15 into 10 or to 5 or to 3. Or if even having 2 is too many objects and that they are having a hard time being successful with 2 options, maybe we just use the right, correct option for a while until that's really, really cemented before you add in these other distracting elements. How do you guys think that you could use something like that in your home life to teach something to your child?
You know, we look through the Where's Waldo books.
Yeah.
And usually I'll just put my hand up to where the general area of where we're looking. And
Yeah.
instead of looking for the whole page,
Definitely.
she'll get frustrated and doesn't want to continue.
Yeah, those are really hard. And so like giving her just like a smaller area, that's like probably way easier. And that's a really good way to like work on some of those cognitive skills with Brianna in like a really fun way. You know, you're looking at a book, you're not sitting in this work session working on these skills, but you're working on something like that in this much more naturalistic way.
Right.
So that's a really great way to use this simplification. Any other ideas about that?
We're helping Luke. He knows how to feed from a spoon, but he won't at home. So we make it simple. Sometimes we hand him the spoon, it goes in his mouth, and then we let go and let him finish the task. He can't complete the task all by himself, but we'll simplify eating with a spoon by helping him a fourth of the way to get through the task of eating his applesauce.
Definitely. So, and then eventually, once Luke's mastered that one part, then you can add in another small part.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And we're actually going to talk about that later at where we use like what's called chaining to teach like these more complicated skills. We use a lot like in potty training, where we teach like one very small skill at a time, and eventually we chain